The news has just blown up with Ozempic.
Ozempic.
It's one of the biggest weight loss trends currently on the market, Ozempic.
Does it live up to the hype?
Nothing ever lives up to hype, right? It's a phenomenal drug. And I say that within the context that it's been studied and defined. However,
there are medical risks and there are personal risks. What are the differences?
We don't do a good job of talking about this. Medical risks, we usually talk in terms of minor and major. Now, non-medical risks get really interesting, right? And I think deeper, but also harder to talk about because they're not measurable in the same way.
Who should be using Ozempic? Is it only for obese people? Where's the cutoff?
I think a better way to think about it is the notion of risk benefit. You have to have a more nuanced discussion because the risk profile becomes more and more questionable. Most people who are taking them, it seems like they end up coming off of them after 2 years.
Is that going to be the norm where you have to be on this for your entire life or you wean yourself off? How does this work now?
Great question. And this is exactly why I'm suspicious of narratives, because I can tell you the story both ways.
We're here to talk about Ozempic, and Ozempic is under the term GLP-1 drugs. So can you just define what that actually means?
Sure. So GLP-1 agonists, they're a class of drugs that mimic the GLP. I actually don't know what the acronym stands for, to be totally fair. And functionally in the body, one of the big things they do is they slow down digestion. So we want to get a little bit into the history. The first generation of GLP agonist medications was exenatide. And they discovered this, I believe, by looking at like Gila monsters or like one of these like lizard species that can eat a whole carcass and then like digest it for a month or something. And so started mimicking those agents and gradually got it into humans, found that it slowed digestion and improved diabetic markers. It was first marketed as a diabetes drug. By slowing digestion, it reduced the speed of sugar absorption, better blood sugar control, so on and so forth was the original idea. We noticed, obviously, when we started giving this to people, that people tended to lose weight because once you slow down digestion, people tend to eat less because they're still digesting the previous meal. They're still absorbing nutrients. That led to the next generation, liraglutide, and now the latest, then the next generation was Ozempic, and the latest is Mounjaro or tirzepatide, and that is hits two different receptors, GLP-1 as well as GIP, both of which reduce appetite, improve what we call satiety. And what we've seen with this latest generation, as so often happens in medicine, is that we are seeing effects we did not anticipate and that are not well explained by the story I just told you. So the story I just told you is what I learned as a med student or a resident when these drugs were coming out. And now we're seeing effects that a little bit start to undercut that story. So just as one example, for instance, we're seeing reports of improvements in like alcoholism, right, or other addictions. And so then it's starting to seem like these drugs improve satiety, the sense of being satisfied, in a much broader way than would be explained merely by slowing down digestion. Right? Merely slowing digestion does not quite account for the notion of satisfying my need for alcohol with one drink instead of 10 drinks. That's a different sense of satiety, right? So it does seem like, so now I'm going to tell the story differently. So that's the historical story. And then the modern story is that there is some impact in the brain, which I don't know, and I don't think I've ever read anyone that gave a great explanation of this, that impacts the sense of satiety, the sense of fullness that we get per unit of food, per calorie, or per protein, or per a volume. And we don't, again, volume wouldn't explain alcohol, right? And so the story starts to break down a little bit when we start to see these other effects of, ordinarily I have to get blackout drunk with 10 drinks to be satisfied. I'm never really satisfied by my alcohol intake. And now all of a sudden, one drink, I'm satisfied all of a sudden. And then there's a mimicry as to what degree does that apply to food? Is that, hey, I'm having morbid obesity, I'm severely obese, and I'm never really satisfied by food. And I just keep eating it, right? And that's how I got to be 400, 500 pounds. And now all of a sudden I'm able to eat a meal and stop and be satisfied with that meal, be satisfied with that smaller portion. So one of the themes you'll see on my channel a lot is I'm very suspicious of the biochemical narratives that we give to things. We can see that this drug hits this receptor, and then we tell some story about it slowing digestion, and there's this storytelling about what's going on, when really what we know is when we give this class of medications, somehow people reduce their food intake, and so they are anorectic drugs is probably the better term than even GLP, because, as I said, tirzepatide, the Mounjaro, the new medication, hits two different receptors. It's not just GLP; it's GLP and GIP, and describing them in terms of their effects, that they are satiety medications or anorectic medications, may be a better description overall.
Wow, that's incredible. I actually didn't know that. So when it comes to the next version, the next iteration, in theory, we've kind of just hit the tip of the iceberg as far as what's capable. I mean, they're still doing research on you just jab yourself and maybe you can have 2 beers and not need 10.
Yeah, so I have not seen double-blind placebo-controlled trials on the addictive aspects yet, right? I believe I have seen reports that they have started those trials, but I haven't seen results. I have my medical news feed of articles and journal articles. I think I did see that one has been published, but I haven't read the results myself yet. But it's coming. The anecdotal reports were so profound. And there's an analogy there, right? Is that these started as diabetic drugs, and then we noticed that people were losing weight, and we said, "Wait, what's going on?" Now we're giving them for weight loss, and we're noticing that people are reducing their alcohol intake, and so then there's an investigation separately to be done about, well, if we give it versus placebo, do we actually see a reduction in alcohol intake or drug intake or social media intake? How far does this sense of satiety go? There's an interesting question there.
Yeah, incredible. When it comes to strictly weight loss, the news has just blown up with Ozempic. It's the miracle drug, right?
Totally.
Does it live up to the hype?
Nothing ever lives up to hype, right? Even the hype doesn't live up to the hype. It's a phenomenal drug, and I say that within the context that it's been studied and defined, which is in the morbidly obese, right? Going back to the 1980s with fen-phen, we've been looking for a medication that helps people lose weight with minimal side effects. Fen-phen caused heart damage, so that got taken off the market. Then we've had, actually, and one of the earlier generations, Victoza, there's or liraglutide, it has a brand name Saxenda, which is actually approved for weight loss. Same class of medication, GLP-1. It just wasn't as strong as the effect we're seeing with Wegovy, which is semaglutide, right? So that's the second generation. The third generation, just there was a significant upgrade in this weight loss effect. It was already there, even in generation 2. So we've seen that already. And, exenatide, the first generation that I mentioned, did have concerns for pancreatitis. We still see that in the semaglutide, the latest, but much less, right? There's concern, it is slowing I told you that the story may not explain what we see, that it's slowing the digestion, but it does slow digestion. And so if it slows it all the way to a stop, you can have gastroparesis. You can actually stop your intestine, which is you'd end up in the hospital, right? So nothing in medicine is risk-free. That doesn't, almost nothing, right? And these aren't either. But they certainly have a better side effect profile than fen-phen, right? And they certainly have a better risk profile. There's some reports in mostly in rats of perhaps increasing the risk of thyroid cancers. There are reports, and I'm not trying to downplay those, but percentage wise, um, these are an important class of drugs. The next generation, as I said, tirzepatide has already out, Mounjaro, um, and there are more in the pipeline where the goal is to continue increasing the effect and decreasing the side effect profile as this is generation, 4 or 5. Now we're 6, 7, 8, 9 generations. We'll try and kind of refine that. As with so many things, I think we'll hit a plateau. The improvement from here is going to be, it's not going to be a huge improvement. It's going to be stepwise. Um, and the drug's importance in terms of hype or living up to the hype is in the context of the obesity epidemic, right? Like if we weren't having an obesity epidemic, this would not be living up to the hype. But in that context where we are as a culture, as a civilization, perhaps trying to figure out something that's evolutionarily new, how do we cope with a situation in which we are chronically exposed to caloric excess in highly palatable forms that have never really existed before, in highly accessible forms, prepackaged, pre-cooked, ready-made, that have never really existed before. And so in that context, I think there are people who are struggling with obesity, and this drug can be an important aspect of helping them have better outcomes overall. So I have a very mathematical, sorry, I'm going on a little bit at length here, but I have a very mathematical outlook on these things in the sense of like, hey, if I give this drug to this person and 1,000 like them, or 10,000 like them, or 1,000,000 that are relatively like them in age and demographic and weight and so on and so forth, am I overall reducing or improving the rates of heart attack, stroke, early death, so on and so forth? And I do think you will with this drug. I mean, we are seeing reductions in mortality, and that's important. I can't say that that's not. However, most people who are taking them, it seems like they end up coming off of them after 2 years, and so that could be cost related, that could be hassle related. That could be a side effect relation. So if we just I should be clear to the audience, I'm wildly speculating here, but just as an example or an analogy of an example is, what if that early satiety concept applies to something like how easily satisfied I am with affection, and now my relationships break down, right? So we don't know how far that easy satisfaction extends, and so there may be negative effects that we're not aware of. Those are the unknown unknowns, and so it's not clear why people are coming off of it after about 2 years. And like so many things, then the question is: are they just going to regain the weight, or are they going to regain some percentage of the weight? I think we're still waiting to hear.
Yeah, so I'd like to get into the long-term stuff in 1 second, because you brought up something here that's important. So there was a study in 2022 that found that people that stopped taking semaglutide after 68 weeks of use regained 2/3 of their weight loss. So is that, I mean, if people are using this for 2 years and then kind of coming off, is that going to be the norm, where almost you have to be on this for your entire life, or you wean yourself off? How does this work now?
Great question. And this is exactly why I'm suspicious of narratives, because I can tell you the story both ways, right? I'll tell you the story that actually, when you've been on it for 2 years, what happens is that it readjusts your body's natural set point or settling point for weight, and you've already adapted, and your body no longer is trying to push you to that weight. And therefore, if we extend it longer, maybe 5 years, then actually we'll see that people don't regain the same amount of weight as they would with a shorter dose. Or I can tell you the story, actually, yes, this is increasing the satiety in the brain. And actually, the minute you come off the brain, you're actually going to get a rebound, and you're going to be more hungry than you ever were before. And you're actually going to end up regaining the weight and more. So the way to tell is to do it, right? The way to tell is to do the study. And yeah, you got to try all the permutations. Is okay. This is what happens after 2 years, after 5 years, after whatever, and you've got to play out these stories to see whether any of them hold water. Um, and I can conceive of it going both ways.
How long have we been studying Ozempic in the sense of weight loss instead of diabetic side
Oh,
of
that's a
things?
good question. I actually don't know that I know the dates exactly. Certainly, we saw weight loss with the GLP-1s in a diabetic context many years ago now. This was quite long before Wegovy was approved as a weight loss medication. We knew that semaglutide as Ozempic for diabetics was causing weight loss. So in a not in a diabetic population, we've known about this for years. In a general overweight population, um, I don't know. I lose track of time. I feel like it's been 3 years. About. Um, I know we've been studying it before that, but I feel like that's when it really started to take off. Was probably about 3 years ago. But that's I don't.
So if they want to study long-term effects of this, how far in the future do they need to be doing the research before they know truly what the long-term effects are?
One of the elevations in my thought was incorporating very deeply the concept of Bayes' theorem into my approach to science. And so rather than conceiving of things in a binary of yes, it's safe, no, it's not safe, I would propose that we consider the notion of safety as a sense of how certain are you that it's safe. And that certainty will grow progressively with time. So it's not binary in that sense, but after, it's been a certain number of years, we've had at least 20 years of experience since exenatide, or 30 now. So it's, with the class of medications, we've had more experience. With semaglutide itself, we've had less experience, but at least 10 years has been studied. I mean, in some context, including diabetes and so on and so forth. Um, so then 20, 30, 40 years, we won't know till we get there, right? We are certainly seeing reductions in mortality. We saw that early. That was one of the big selling points of these medications for diabetics. And as with anything, so I'll make an analogy to the COVID vaccine here. So if you're trying to say how effective is the COVID vaccine and how safe is it and whether there's a risk benefit, well, are we talking about a 90-year-old or are we talking about a 20-year-old? Because the risk was different. And so the benefit of the vaccine is tremendously higher because it reduces that specific risk. Now, if the vaccine has other side effects, in a 90-year-old, you care less because it's reducing a huge risk. Whereas if you're giving it to a 20-year-old man, you care a lot about those side effects because the risk you're reducing is not that significant. And now the risk of the medication goes up. And so similarly with Ozempic, if we're talking about what is the risk profile for someone who's 500 pounds, that's very different than the risk profile of somebody who wants to lose the last 10. Their actual health risk is from the weight is not significant enough that the risk benefit is likely to be there in a pure mortality sense.
You have talked about risk in the sense of there are medical risks and there are personal risks. So, can you just go into a little bit more depth onto medical risk versus personal risk? What are the differences?
This is a deep topic, one of my favorites actually. In general, I think we don't do a good job of talking about this. So, medical risks, we usually talk in terms of minor and major. So, you say, okay, is it causing more acid reflux? Is it causing nausea? Right? Those are some of the milder. Is it causing gastroparesis that lands me in the hospital? That's a major risk. Is it causing pancreatitis? That's a major risk, ends me in the hospital. Is it causing, I don't think this is necessarily the case, but what if the rat studies are true and it causes thyroid cancer in some people? Okay, well, that's a major risk, right? For me, I tend to focus primarily on mortality, only because not because I think that's the most important thing, but because I think that's the clearest thing, right? Is whether someone died or not is probably the clearest indication we have. It's easy to report. It's easy to not be subjective, right? Um, so those medical risks, I think, are better, are easier to quantify. They're easier to measure. Did someone end up in the hospital? Yes or no, right? Um, with one of these diagnoses specifically, right? Um, did someone die? Yes or no, right? You can then get a little bit softer and say, okay, did someone experience this discomfort, reflux, right? Nausea? Did someone experience a negative life event or a negative medical life event, right? So, um, whatever, mild pancreatitis that didn't send them to the hospital. Um, so those are probably the major medical risks. And the way I quantify whether it's medical is, do we have sort of a coding system for it? Do we have a tracking system for it? Now, non-medical risks get really interesting, right? Um, and I think deeper, but also harder to talk about because they're not measurable in the same way. I think one of the big benefits that I've felt in my life in trying to lose weight and count calories and lift weights and exercise is the opportunity to develop the ability to push through discomfort, the ability to define for myself what is painful, and that has changed progressively over the years as I've pushed harder and harder, and I've learned to push harder and harder. Um, to what, and then that system gets reapplied in other areas of my life. As a child, my mom will attest, I was not at all disciplined. I had no the moment I ran into an obstacle, I really kind of bailed on the project. Um, I had a lot of focus. I had a lot of ability to learn, but I didn't have a lot of ability to persevere through difficulty. And that was built in experience, right? Now, I certainly think there are plenty of experiences that people could build those in, but exercise has historically been one that we're evolutionarily adapted to. And so if we remove that as a need, if we're all fit via Ozempic, what are the consequences for our ability to work through relationships when they get difficult, our ability to persevere in careers when they get difficult? We don't know. And maybe nothing, right? I'm not trying to like fearmonger here. Maybe there's no impact whatsoever. But I do think it's interesting to think about as unknown unknowns, right? In terms of like, sure, we're seeing benefits in alcohol, but are we seeing reductions in people's sex lives? I don't know. Like, and where's the balance here, right? So the notion of unintended effects, I think, is important to just track. And I'm not trying to dissuade anyone from using it or not using it, but being a little more aware of the notion of non-physiologic effects is. I don't know that I completely answered your question, but I think those are some of the things I think about.
No, I think that you hit it, and I have to say I want to add on to that because I was reading an article. I'm forgetting who said this, but it was some sort of celebrity. They were saying how Ozempic has essentially created a crazy beauty standard because all the celebrities are on it when they don't necessarily need to be on it for medical purposes, but they're creating now. Everyone looks at them and says, I want to be that skinny, and it's not possible. So you may have some sort of ripple effect in society saying that's what beauty is, and it's only attainable through a drug.
There's interesting correlations. We're just going down that rabbit hole of speculation, right? So we're not in science territory here. We're just in speculatory territory, but it's fun. So I do wonder, I think, like, if you consider beauty, part of what beauty is representation, right? Like in older times, more fat content was considered more beautiful because it was representation of wealth, of available resources, of so on and so forth. In many ways, I think skinniness has become a representation of having leisure time, of wealth again, but having time to pay attention to this, to go to the gym, to count calories, to do whatever you're doing to achieve that physique. Um, and just like so many things, if Chris Williamson has a quote that I like, is that, you know, if you have six pack abs, right, the story of six pack abs is the story of your self control, of all the waffles you didn't eat, right? Now we're changing. We're saying like a butterfly that's mimicking the poisonous butterfly. Well, I can have the six pack abs without having that story, right? So I'm representing a level of discipline that I don't have as a person, but I have the symbol of that discipline. And for a little while, people will pursue that symbol because we need shorthands for these things. We need, we're looking for people like who's reliable, who's disciplined, who's whatever, smart, competent, whatever we're looking for. Um, and throughout evolutionary history and social history and cultural history and biological history, we have found ways of mimicking the signals and symbols, because it gets us the advantage that actually having the thing would give us without necessarily the same effort level. And if we project out long enough, we'll come up with new symbols, right? And so, yes, in the short term, I think it's very possible you'll end up with exactly what you've described. In the long run, we'll come up with other symbols of trying to find the people that we're looking for.
Yeah, I could believe that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. To bring it back into, I guess, the realm of science or the realm of medical recommendations. So Ozempic is mainly meant for people that are obese, but let's maybe go through some spectrums of like who should be using Ozempic. Is it only for obese people, or where's the cutoff?
Again, I think if we think a little more mathematically and nuanced, right? Medical societies will tell you, the cutoff is a particular BMI, right? They'll say, oh, okay, if you're above 35 BMI, that's the cutoff. That's where it was studied. That's the study population. I think a better way to think about it is what we briefly touched on before, is the notion of risk benefit, right? And so what is the risk of being 2 pounds overweight? Medically, not much. Like longevity wise, nothing, right? Now I'll take my own example here, I guess. And this is not intended necessarily as a plug, but I'm single at 42, right? Now, if I had a six pack, would I have a better chance of finding a partner? Now that's a cost. That's an interesting cost, right? That's an interesting risk. And so if Ozempic offers me to not be as disciplined as it would require to get a six pack, but to still get the symbol, and that improves my love life or my intimacy life or my access to a partner, well, I don't know. That's a benefit I might be willing to take some risk for, right? Well, not me personally, but I tried it and it wasn't for me. But yeah, I don't know that I would fault anyone if they said, "Hey, yeah, you know what? Like, I'm lonely, and loneliness has a negative mortality risk, right? And hey, yeah, you know what? This drug would help me be more confident and feel better and whatever. Okay, cool. You want to take the risk of pancreatitis? You want to take the risk of long-term unknown effects? You want to take, cool, like do it. Like, I think we can have that conversation. I think we can say, but not blindly, right? Not blind to the notion that like there may be unknown risks here. We're wading into territory we may not be familiar with. This you might, okay, you find a partner and then you stop taking the drug and that relationship falls apart. Like, is your relationship contingent on this drug? That's a weird position to be in, right? How does that feel to you emotionally? Do you feel like you genuinely are loved, or do you feel like it's contingent? Like that's a weird place to be. And so if you think it through carefully, I think you could have a reasonable conversation about risks and benefits, and you could make that decision even in the non-obese, right? Um, Certainly with the obese, it's easier because that's what the study population was done There's a more obvious risk of mortality there that is mitigated by the drug, and so it's a little bit to me like, hey, okay, if you what's a good example? So if you are overweight, maybe you have an increased risk of cancer, different cancers, right? Well, if you have cancer, now's not exactly the time to start talking about the weight loss, right? Like, I actually do have to treat the cancer first. In the same way, weight itself at a certain point, is such a risk factor for health. It's like, hey, do you maybe need to develop better discipline or better habits around food or better? Sure. But actually, it would be better if we had that conversation when you're already significantly lighter, right? And so I think the opportunity, especially in those who are obese, to say, hey, let's get you down 15% of your body weight, right? And then have a conversation about how we can improve your relationship with food. Um, so the decision is just easier there, I think, because the risks are higher. As you go down the weight gradient, right, of body fat, uh, you have to have a deeper and deeper and more nuanced discussion because the risk profile becomes more and more questionable, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely a great way of looking at it. I mean, how easy is it to get Ozempic? Do you just need to go to your general practitioner?
Probably not. I would say probably my approach to this is unusual among physicians. Uh, insurance has had its effects, right? Like, you can't have a nuanced, thoughtful discussion about your emotional state and your likelihood of finding a mate with your. There's 5 minutes. There's no time for that kind of thing. At least here in the States, I mean, so I believe there was a study that said that if you go see your primary care physician, the time that the patient is allowed to speak before the physician interrupts them is 23 seconds. And so, yeah, you're not having super nuanced discussions at that point, right? You're having algorithmic, is your BMI over the cutoff that was approved in the studies? Yes, no. If so, a very good physician might say, hey, you should probably start this or whatever. Even that often is not being done very well. Um, and then the cost, right? It's very expensive when prescribed in the auto injector. I have tremendous issues with the way the pharmaceutical companies have done this, right? Like, they've created these auto injecting pens that only give certain doses. So I can't adjust. If you need 3 units, I can't give you a prescription for that, from a non-compounded source. I can't give you there's no auto injector. It comes in standardized doses. So if you go from one dose to the next and your side effects go up too high, I can't bring you anywhere in the middle, right? And so now, if you go to a compounding pharmacy, which is what is making access so much easier, but also more questionable, and we can talk about the risks there. There are some. Then it's a syringe. You get a vial of semaglutide, and you can dose it sort of however you want, right? Working ideally with a physician who can help. But yeah, it's very easy to get compounded semaglutide, very difficult to get prescribed semaglutide, or I guess compounded is technically prescribed, but to get pharmaceutical semaglutide in the auto injectors. Availability has been an issue. It's, my mom's on it for diabetes, and it's constantly out of stock. So it's creating an issue there. But yeah, I think the compounded form, you hop online, you'll find 1,000 people ready to prescribe for no reason at all. You don't have to justify yourself. Just say, I want it, and I feel like I want to lose weight, and you'll get a prescription for compounded semaglutide pretty easily. The quality control on that's less, right? The risk of infection is higher. The risk of, the compound being degraded, so on and so forth. There's all the risks that go along with exiting the tightly controlled pharmaceutical industry, and going with a compounded medication that's bought from overseas or manufactured God knows where. But on the other hand, the pharmaceutical companies haven't done a great job of making it available. So, yeah, cuts both ways, I think.
Is that going to get regulated more, or are we going to see more influx of a properly dosed, controlled versions? How do you see the future going there?
I don't know. I question the degree to which we can really know what is in the best interests of the pharmaceutical companies, right? It may be very well that an ongoing continuous shortage is in their financial best interest, and that's what we'll see, right? If that's not the case, if the numbers work out such that they think they can make more money by increasing production, then we'll see that. Um, yeah, so it really depends on what we think we'll see, and of course, the notion of making it generic. So, what happens when the patents run out? That may also change things a lot. Where okay, now other people can manufacture it, and so on and so forth. Um, yeah, I think if anybody has a way of tracking meaningfully what decisions will be in the best interest of the pharmaceutical companies, you can pretty much say that that's what's going to happen. I just don't know what that is.
Fair enough. um, but you talked about something earlier. I want to go back to that, which is you personally have used Ozempic, and so just kind of get into your how it went for you. Yeah, just go into the details.
Yeah, so I certainly wanted to lose the last few pounds I had, right? So not in the obese category there, using it off label in the way that is higher risk, right? Um, for exactly the reasons I talked about. Like, will I be more attractive? Will I, get six pack abs, be able to attract a partner, so on and so forth, right? So all of those reasons are in play. Um, Aware and nervous about the notion of gastroparesis or the risk of pancreatitis. So I certainly was nervous about that. I also have an ongoing sort of scientific curiosity. I like trying things out. I often try things out on myself. So this is not the first thing I've tried out on myself, nor will it probably be the last. Um, and so my experience of it was fascinating. I was really interested by it on a couple different levels. Um, the most interesting level, which I'll get back to, is when I was taking it, I realized a subtle aspect of why I was taking it that I didn't know before I took it. So my experience was like this. I had a little bit of nausea when I first took it, wore off by the next day. When I bumped up the dose, that got more pronounced and lasted a little longer, along with some acid reflux. My experience, I love food. I really love food. I can eat insane amounts of food if I let myself. I have a huge sweet tooth. And by the way, this is the other thing that I suffer no negative effects. Like, I will eat a box of donuts and feel phenomenal. Like, I never feel bloated. I don't feel bad. I don't feel like sluggish or brain fog. I have no negative feedback loop for indulging absurd eating habits. And so, the other than weight gain, right? Which is a longer term negative feedback loop. So it was very interesting to me when I was on the drug to lose interest in eating a meal halfway through. So I would be eating and I would just not really be interested in finishing. And there was truly a sense of disinterest. It was I'm bored with this now. Let me go do something else. And that I was very unusual as an experience. I think that was beneficial. Now, I wanted to lose weight. But really, I wanted to lose fat. I did not want to lose muscle, right? And in the studies, without careful adjustment, people lost 50% fat, 50% muscle. So yes, they lost 15% of their body weight, but half of it was muscle. That's not what I wanted. Now, the reason that they lost that muscle was not related to the drug. Any calorie restriction will do that, right? Bodybuilders have known this forever, is that if you severely calorie restrict someone, you lose a mix of fat and muscle, unless you take in a significant amount of protein and lift weights intensely. When you're in a calorie restriction, that becomes progressively more difficult, right? So especially since I was losing interest in food, I found myself having to count and track my protein intake very, very carefully in order to hit a target, you know, that would hopefully prevent me from losing the muscle, right? While also lifting, while also continuing to work out. Um, and what I realized was that was in itself a bit of a hassle, right? To really rigorously track my protein intake. And I realized that the real reason I wanted to use the drug to lose weight is because I didn't want a calorie count. I didn't want to count. And the drug, the illusion of the drug, and I think this is true of special diets as well, whether it's intermittent fasting or keto or whatever the latest diet thing is can you lose weight without counting, without having to count, without having to track? That's the real thing we're all trying to avoid in any of these things. And once I bit the bullet on tracking protein, I might as well track calories. And then the value of the drug was gone, right? And I was like, well, if I'm counting anyway, then I'll just do it without the drug, right? And so I've lost the weight now using pretty standard bodybuilding type methods, right? So I lost the weight that I was hoping to lose, but not with the drug, because once I ended up biting the bullet on counting, I was like, well, okay. Now, that is in the context of my relationship with hunger, is I don't, I'm able to tolerate being hungry. As much as I love food, I'm not compelled to satisfy my hunger, right? I can distract myself quite well when I need to. And so once I got rid of that tracking obstacle and I bit the bullet on that, then it's been okay for me. Now, other people, friends of mine who have tried it, part of their struggle is they feel much more compelled to eat when they're hungry. They have trouble self-regulating that. And so it's, yes, they don't want to track, but also when they feel that hunger, especially under stress, they tend to give into it, in a more compulsory way. And so they've benefited from it. And again, I'm just interested how this comes down to individual psychology. We were talking about risks earlier, right? Like, I think it comes down very strongly to individual psychology. What are the real reasons you're overweight, right? And in my case, I didn't want to track. Like, I didn't want to pay that much attention to my food. I didn't want to constantly have to log and weigh every chicken breast. Now, once I bit the bullet on that and I said, fine, you know what? I'm going to weigh every chicken breast. Well, now I don't need the drug, but my friend still does because that's not his issue, right? So yeah, that was my experience, and I ended up coming off of it and just kind of losing the weight in other ways. And by the way, I didn't lose much weight on it. That was also interesting. Is despite losing interest in meals halfway through, because I was still forcing myself to consume enough protein, I still didn't really lose the weight, right? And so, I'm not in that category of the obese where almost any calorie restriction will produce weight loss, right? For me, I'm trying to lose fat without losing muscle. I'm trying to thread a much narrower needle because I'm not that overweight, and especially at my age, I had to bite the bullet on rigorous tracking. And hey, I'm taking in 150 grams of protein and 1,400 calories, and that's the way it is. I'm doing it in 8 to 12 week bursts, and then switching to maintenance for 8 to 12 weeks, and then I'll do another 8 to 12 week burst of fat loss until I hit my goal weight. And that's how I'm doing it. But the drug was different.
While you were on the drug and after, you were continuously going to the gym, working out,
Mhm.
and okay, so there are some like continuous life standards that you weren't just taking it expecting it to do all the work, you were also putting in some effort on the other end.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. It's important for people to understand that is the drug, and that's where we started. So maybe looping back around is it is an anorectic drug. It reduces your appetite. That is its fundamental mode of action, right? Or increases how easily satisfied you are by eating, right? Either way you want to think of that. It does nothing more. So that's all the drug does, and theoretically in many people that will produce a calorie deficit, and that is how they lose weight. So the drug is not directly causing weight loss. The drug is not increasing your metabolism. It is just increasing how easily you're satisfied by food. And then it's down to your psychology as to whether that results in a calorie deficit. And if you're in a calorie deficit, you can pay attention to how much of that calorie deficit also is a protein deficit, and whether you're working out sufficiently to make most of the weight loss fat loss, or whether you're also going to lose muscle in the process. So every step of the way, yes, you have aspects that are still up to you. The drug is only producing this one very specific effect, which is reduction of appetite, or ease of satisfaction.
That definitely, like you said, circled back, kind of closed that loop. So amazing. The last thing I wanted to just ask, is there any place that people, if they want to get in touch with you or ask more questions, or even see your other videos, what's your YouTube channel? Where can people reach you?
Sure, on YouTube, that's probably my main social media outlet. I would say is YouTube at River Rock Medical. Um, so look up my name, Dr. Zain Hakeem, or River Rock Medical, or youtube.com/ at River Rock Medical. That'll take you there. I am on Twitter at Dr. Zain Hakeem. I am not on Instagram, or I am, but the River Rock Medical is on Instagram. I am rarely not on Instagram, so it's not really worth reaching out there. Or riverrockmedical.com is to my practice website. So anybody who wants to find me in Austin, or become a patient, then that's where you can find me.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Hakeem, I really appreciate the time here. It's been enlightening. And yeah, I wish you the best. We'll talk soon then.
Awesome. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Right on.
Thanks.
I'll talk to you soon then. See ya.